All right, good morning, everybody. I'm going to cut right to it. This is a Lift Chapel, and as Elena mentioned, our topic is life, which can go a lot of different directions. I got a lot to say, not going to lie, but I hope you get something out of it today. So I want to start by taking you back in time a little bit, historically speaking, as I like to do. The year is 1942. The world is at war. The United States, arguably without a choice, is now fully invested on a war in two fronts, providing aid to the Allied assault on Germany and spearheading the war effort in the Pacific against the Japanese Empire of the Rising Sun. After Pearl Harbor just a year earlier, there is no doubt that the U.S. has a quarrel with Japan, and in general, public opinion and sentiment reflect this. The American people certainly wanted justice for the attack on their home soil. Widespread fear of Japan increased among American citizens, as many believed the large population of Japanese-born American citizens were intentionally sent over as spies or covert ops in support of the Rising Sun. Theodore Geisel, a cartoonist for famous American publications, including the Saturday Evening Post, became a very active voice in American propaganda during the war. Using his cartoons to criticize the sitting president FDR and sway public opinions in the war effort, Geisel earned a reputation as a controversial and opinionated cartoonist. Chief among Geisel's commentaries was a strong anti-Japanese sentiment, as he certainly harbored no sympathy for Japanese American citizens. In fact, a 1942 cartoon entitled "Waiting for the Signal Home" reflected a very suspicious mindset, depicting hundreds of Japanese Americans receiving dynamite and other weaponry from a Japanese officer. Using blatant facial stereotypes and very racist imagery, Geisel's anti-Japanese narrative was shared throughout the United States and likely contributed to a skeptical, racist, and demeaning public perception of all of Japan. Fast forward to 1954. The war has since ended and 2 atomic bombs have since been dropped on Japan, and surprisingly, Geisel's views of Japan have started to radically change. Geisel has realized, after seeing the destruction of Japan and the pain caused by 2 atomic bombs upon innocent people, that his perception was wrong. In response, the cartoonist does what he did best. He wrote and illustrated a story. It was a clear return to the children's book genre that had once made Geisel very famous under the pen name Dr. Seuss. The resulting story is a now familiar one you have probably read or even seen the video depiction of, Horton Hears a Who, in which Horton, a kind and gentle elephant, protects the survival of the microscopic and located on a speck of dust city of Whoville, all while continuously stating, "A person's a person, no matter how small." See, during World War II, Dr. Seuss failed to realize the humanity that all people, despite their cultures, beliefs, and actions, share. He failed to recognize the value of life. Yet greater events opened his eyes and motivated him to atone for his hurtful cartoons and narratives, creating a beloved children's story with an incredible message, one that for Chapel today I would like to tweak to "A life is a life, no matter how small." It's a statement I hope most of us can agree with, yet as I continue to look at things around us in our world, I'm shocked and disturbed by how often this is ignored. History shows us that humanity has rarely valued life. For example, look at the Roman Empire. The Romans upheld a culture of violence. Life was cheap in the Roman Empire. Emperors frequently ordered various executions to please their appetites for blood. The Roman masses flocked to the Colosseum to watch religious and cultural minorities fight to the death as cheers flooded the arena. While the Roman Empire was built on conquest and in order to maintain society and security, the city itself featured homicides and crime. And at its worst, the sewer in the waste ditch outside of the main city was filled with unwanted babies and children, one of the earliest forms of abortion. Centuries later, Europe and the United States exemplify a continued devaluing of human life, as the slave trade remained a constant and perceived necessity because of the economic impact. Africa itself became the cornerstone of the slave trade, as European traders would separate families and abduct innocent people only to take them on a dangerous journey to the civilized world, where a life of labor, toil, and pain awaited them. It is estimated that by 1860, in the United States alone, there were nearly 4 million people in slavery, 4 million lives forced into labor and suffering. And that leads me back to the time of Dr. Seuss. In the midst of World War II, one of history's darkest moments included the rise of Nazi Germany and the events of the Holocaust. From 1941 to 1945, a genocide or systematic killing and elimination of some 6 million Jewish people and other ethnic minorities occurred, all in the name of patriotism and perfection. These lives were terrorized, herded into camps, forced into labor, and often, unfortunately, systematically murdered. One would think that after all of these historical instances and many others unnamed, life would be valued and protected in a civilized and, quote, postmodern world. Yet tragically, the opposite is the case. I would argue that the value of human life is even lower today. In the United States in 2020 alone, a 15% increase in a year where we were quarantined, homicide rate occurred. Not to mention the fact that our media, music, TV, video games, and the like encourage and display countless amounts of bloodshed. It is currently also estimated that there are almost 40 million people worldwide in some sort of slavery, with sexual exploitation dominating those statistics. And most tragically, thousands of unborn babies are aborted every year. If you look at the argument I've just laid out, I think I've just made the case that our world has never valued life, and unfortunately, it never will. It's one of the tragic products of living in a world forever tainted by sin. Yet I refuse to shrug it off and say, it happens. Because as a follower of Christ, I know that I'm called to do more. I know that we are called to defend life, no matter the age, color, culture, or circumstance. Because a life is a life, no matter how small. It's easy to ignore the sanctity of life of others because often we only care about one life, that being our own. As long as our lives aren't threatened, then what's the problem? It doesn't affect me. Why should I worry about it? I know personally I fall into this. I'm very grateful for my life, and I don't know if my life's ever been threatened. Yet at the same time, for some unfathomable reason, God has gifted me the ability to live and function and everything else I get at pretty much no cost to me. And the craziest thing about this is that it wasn't random. My creation is not random. Your creation is not random. You and I both were intently and purposefully and uniquely created. Someone took the time and the effort to plan and create every single detail that goes into every single life. It's an incredible gift. One that I'm not sure we're always thankful for. But the best part about this gift, I'm not the only one who has it. You're not the only one who has it. All people have received the gift of being created. Regardless of situation and background, we have been gifted life by God. And there was intent for each life, just as it is for me and just as it is for you. See, earlier this year, we discussed what it means to be made in the image of God. This is a theme that should not be unfamiliar to you. Earlier this year, I spoke of Jeremiah, the prophet, and in Jeremiah chapter 1, God famously said, "Before I made you, I knew you." There was purpose and intent in every single life God created. God knows each one personally. He wants a relationship with each one. He gave each one different gifts that no life would be the same, but that each life was meant to be lived. God is the creator. He is the author. He is the initiator, not of some life, not of one life, but of all life. And so since he decides when it starts, he decides when it ends. Taking the life of another, devaluing the life of another, it's not a right we have. And I don't just mean taking a life from somebody else. I mean thinking lesser of a life. Murder, slavery, abortion, and overall disdain for the life of another, that's not a right we have. When those things happen, they take the creation that God so perfectly and wonderfully made, and it smashes it into pieces, as if destroying the artwork that someone else poured their lives into. The Bible further speaks to the gift of life. In Psalm 139, it famously says, "For you formed me in my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them." You see, there is purpose and wonder in every life created by God. Who am I to ignore that? Who are we to ignore that? Just a few minutes earlier, I made the claim that history does not value human life, and while I stand by that statement, every historical example I previously mentioned and shared includes a corresponding example of an individual who stepped up to value and protect said life. We'll start with the Roman Empire. At its height, the early Christian church was young. The early Christian church, which often lived underground literally and figuratively because of widespread persecution and a clearly different worldview, continued to speak and stand for life. Those babies I mentioned that were in the ditches outside the city of Rome, well, most of them were picked up by Christians who raised those children as their own. A famous example of the Saint Telemachus, who was martyred as he pleaded with gladiators in the Colosseum itself, begging them to stop fighting stop what they were doing. He was martyred on the field in front of a cheering audience, yet just a week later, the Colosseum was closed forever. You see, despite Rome's affinity for violence, the church stood for what was right, because a life is a life no matter how small. During the height of the transatlantic slave trade in colonial America and Europe, a young British politician named William Wilberforce, who was horrified not only by slavery but also by the overall immorality of the British Empire, fought for an unprecedented set of legislation that not only ended the slave trade, but also encouraged a return to biblical values. Wilberforce feared that Britain had turned so far away from what the Bible had once taught that the slave trade provided an opportunity to not only end that horrible activity, but also get people back to God. And while he abolished the slave trade in 1807, he continued to fight for the overall emancipation of all minorities, which he continued to fight for until his death, because a life is a life, no matter how small. Similarly, as World War II raged and the Holocaust persisted, many European Christians directly intervened on several occasions to protect the lives of the innocent. In Holland, modern-day Netherlands, a watchmaker named Corrie ten Boom, along with her father and sister, protected and hid Jewish refugees in their now famous hiding place, believing that it was the will of God, even when it led to their arrest and subsequent imprisonment in Ravensbrück concentration camp. Despite the fact their lives were at stake, they believed it was the will of God and put others before themselves. In Germany, in the heart of the Nazi regime, a Lutheran pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer was not only outspoken against the Nazi regime, but also willingly served as an officer in the Nazi German military, all only to act as a double agent and attempting to sabotage Nazi efforts, including a plot to kill Hitler. Eventually imprisoned and executed, Bonhoeffer's life exhibited an unselfishness and a bold stand for truth and life in the face of clear evil, because a life is a life, no matter how small. And what of today? Well, Christians continue to take a stand for life. Take, for example, the yearly March for Life, where thousands of Christians fled to Washington, D.C. to vocally and clearly condemn abortion. But I'll be honest, that's not enough. This chapter of history continues to be written. And honestly, it's up to us. We have a wonderful opportunity as a Christian school to make a stand for life, to live in a way that values all life every single day, that protects it and cherishes it. Instead of only being focused on our own lives, we must open our eyes beyond ourselves to the millions of other creations God has perfectly and wonderfully made. It may not be your life on the line. It may not be your life that's threatened. But if you don't stand for others, it might as well be. May God grant us the boldness, the compassion, and the love it takes to protect the sanctity of life every day. Every action, I pray that you choose to speak for life, to stand for life. Because again, if you only stand for your life, what's your purpose? Because a life is a life, no matter how small. Please pray with me. Lord, you have made us fearfully and wonderfully. You have put intention into every single creation. Help us to realize that. Help us to realize that it is not a gift that only a few of us have. It's one that you have given every single person. And Lord, I ask that each of us would find ways to speak for life every single day, to call out injustice, to call out insecurity, to continue to stand for you and the life you so wonderfully gave each and every one of us. Allow us to live in a way that reflects your gift of life, and more importantly, the love you have for each and every one of us. It's It's in your name we pray. Amen.